Today is Thursday, 9 February. Everyone should have completed the reconciliation of the first attempt in Module 1. We'll be posting the final version of the Module 1 assessment between now and close of business tomorrow. Everyone will have until the start of class on Wednesday next week to complete your attempt of the Module 1 assessment. Welcome, Kareem. How are you? Kareem, are you there? All right. What we're going to do today is explore the wonderful interests, resources, and challenges associated with encryption for digital evidence forensics. There are a number of tools and methods that intersect with this fascinating and rapidly evolving group of technologies. And there are some dependencies associated with encryption tools and methods that require a quick look before we continue. So the acronym SAM stands for Security Account Management. This is a term that we introduced in Intro to Cybersecurity. And essentially, there are cases where systems are used in a context where in smaller environments, in professional practices and consultancies, in home office environments, small office, home office environments called SOHO environments, it tends to be the case that a domain environment or a realm, an enterprise framework to manage computer and user accounts is not typically set up. And what happens is that the computer identities, the system identities and computer system accounts, so computer identities, system accounts, and user accounts are all stored and managed independently on standalone systems. In a workgroup environment, this is a standalone security account management model. And you may have seen or heard about specifics in previous courses before, but essentially, if you look at my computer and I go to manage my computer, if it is a professional edition or corporate or enterprise edition, there's a users and groups option in computer management. And it's important to understand that this profoundly affects aspects of encryption and what you encounter with encryption in different environments. And so it's critically important that you understand whichever model of security account management is in play in a given forensic environment. There may be cases where both forms of security account management are in play in a forensic environment, especially for bring your own device environments where this is incredibly chaotic. You have an enterprise domain, but then in the mix you have independent employees that own and control their own system, their own laptop, their own office equipment, and they are the masters of their own digital universe, which means there are limitations with the forensic methods that you can engage or the forensic resources you'll encounter, especially for encryption. And we'll provide some examples for that. The term work group, though, is intentional because if you're in a standalone security account management context, you'll know this because the name of your computer will be associated with a workgroup name. And if you go into advanced system settings, you can look at the computer name tab. And one of the tragedies of default configuration in many environments is that the workgroup name is set to what by default? This is something we covered in Intro to Cyber. Can anybody remember what the default name for workgroup is? Anyone?
Wasn't it work group?
It's workgroup, yes. Give the man a cigar. Not that we want to promote tobacco use among young adults, but yes, you win the prize. The default name for workgroup is workgroup. And if work environment is not intentionally configured for better security to change the workgroup name, then anyone who's connected in that network environment is in the same workgroup. And that implies some challenges in terms of forensics as well, especially if NetBIOS over TCP/IP is enabled. That's a different aspect. We'll cover NetBIOS over TCP/IP in greater depth. That may ring a bell for some of you, but there's a setting in the IP configuration to enable an older protocol that rides on top of the TCP/IP protocol so that old school workgroups can intercommunicate and share and see each other better. And that can be a challenge. In larger businesses, mid-size and larger organizations, the account management, the security account management is often centralized, and that central environment is referred to as a domain. And the database machine or server, the database server that houses all of the security accounts is often referred to as a domain controller. So if you see in the mix a domain controller, it's important to suss out first, okay, are we dealing with a BYOD environment? Do we have independent security account management models in the mix? Is it exclusively an enterprise environment where domain controllers are large and in charge, or in specialty interests? If you have Linux, and Linux or Unix implements a enterprise security account management context, but they're not using Microsoft Windows as infrastructure, this is called a realm instead of a domain. So you can establish a similar centrally managed context in a Linux environment or Unix environment, and it's functions in a similar fashion. There's a directory and centralized storage in a database, a secured database on specific machines, so that the computer identities, the system accounts, and the user accounts are all centrally managed. Now, this may seem like really boring stuff, but the one thing I want you to understand is that if you have influence in the early stages of a forensic program with an organization that wants to implement a strong capacity or an effective, never mind strong, just an effective capacity to work forensics, and in the case that something bad happens, preemptively, okay, preemptively, you want to recommend and urge your clients to consider adoption of a domain implementation. And here's why, okay? I'm going to show you a picture, and this is a crude drawing. Can everybody see this crude drawing? Can everyone see?
Yeah, we can see it. We can see it.
Okay. So in a standalone security account management context, in the work group side of things, let's assume that we have 4 partners in an office, and let's name each of the partners Rhonda, Ronell, Jesus, and Kana. Everybody with me? And let's say this is a professional practice, right? So there's encryption in the mix. the login accounts for Rhonda's machine and the resources that she shares with others is stored exclusively on Rhonda's machine. Now, with certain types of encryption, that means the encryption mechanisms and methods are bound or joined at the hip with Rhonda's computer. And that's critically important to understand. If something bad happens to Rhonda's computer and there's encryption in the mix and you don't have backup keys, you don't have the ability to decrypt stored separately, you're pretty much screwed with anything that you might recover from Rhonda's machine in the event that there's a catastrophe. And I'm not talking about physical catastrophe. I'm just talking about a compromise where Rhonda's machine has been mutilated and mauled by a malicious actor, and the data, basically it's taken out of commission. And so you have a case where you can recover the data as a forensic specialist, but it's encrypted. And the keys required to decrypt that information is stored on what? Oh, the machine that just blew up, right? So is that a problem? Oh, yeah. Now, if Rhonda shares access with Ranel, Jesus, and Kana, and they participate in the sharing of encrypted information, they can exchange keys so they can view things. But that gets to be pretty dicey and pretty difficult. So there are barriers between key sharing. Even simple control, access control becomes complicated. Ranel has to have a separate login account for Rhonda, Kana, and Jesus. Jesus has to have a separate login account on his system for Ranel, Rhonda, and Kana. Kana has to have separate login accounts for Rhonda, Ranel, and Jesus. And because some encryption methods are joined at the hip or integrated with the user identity, meaning the user account, those are uniquely different components. You can't, even if you have the same login and password, because they're on a different machine, the encryption keys are going to end up, when they're generated, being different in each case. So, if it's important to keep things secure and encrypted and all that kind of stuff, and you'll see later on when we talk about simple things like digital signatures and being able to work in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and assurance, there's all manner of complications. Any questions about the natural limitations posed by a standalone workgroup environment? In a domain environment, on the domain controller, the user accounts are stored in a central directory, in a repository called a directory, and that directory is controlled by domain administrators. And that's an important concept to understand, because when we get to specific types of encryption, you're going to find out that domain administrators have secret and powerful tools to work the decryption for a case where somebody's system or account gets compromised. They're referred to as the recovery agent, right? So a domain administrator by default is a EFS, that's for encryption file system recovery agent, and that's a specific type of encryption we'll talk about in a minute. They are by definition configured to be EFS recovery agents for the entire domain. So their login can provide the decryption method to access an encrypted file, even if someone's account is compromised. If it's a domain account, they can recover that. So what am I saying? Even if Rhonda is no longer part of the domain anymore, let's say she left, she took another job, or she was fired or terminated, or let's say Ranel was fired or terminated, basically, or he left to start his own company. If the account no longer exists, the domain admin still has the capacity as a recovery agent. Because the encryption occurred with a domain user account, the domain admin can recover the encrypted data, okay? So we wanted you to understand the dynamic present for encryption scenarios in either environment. Once again, if you have a BYOD environment, you have this for the company, you have a domain, and then you also have this for the independent users. And wow, that gets, it's like you almost need a separate whiteboard and a separate set of resources and a separate index to keep track of all of the different dependencies so that you can work encryption in a digital forensics scenario effectively. Now, given the information I've just shared with you, and I know I've just shared quite a bit, are there any questions that come to mind?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. Now, there's also something called a pub. All right, so before I get back to this, I'm going to start in with this. So you must be mindful. You have to be prepared to adjust accordingly, right? All right, now hashing. What I'd like to do is basically work a quick review of hashing. So, and generically, what we'd like to do is talk about encryption algorithms. There is a one-way, so a hash is a, and this is just brief review, a one-way encryption algorithm that produces a fixed amount of output. And it's encrypted. That cannot be reversed. If any data changes, the hash changes. That's the heart of it. That's what a hashing algorithm does in terms of encryption algorithms. Now, this is a very fast, very quick walkthrough related to encryption, and there are other courses and other modules and other courses that do deep dives for encryption. We covered some basics in Intro to Cyber. This is just a refresher, but when you have two-way encryption, there are two types of ciphers, meaning reversible encryption. Oh, sorry. Anybody remember what they are? The two types of ciphers for two-way reversible encryption? Anyone? Symmetric and asymmetric? Oh yeah, that rings a bell. Everybody remembers that?
No, asymmetrical, asymmetrical. No.
Asymmetric is often called public-private. So in symmetric algorithm, there is and there are two types of symmetric encryption, two types of symmetric algorithms. Whoops, having a hard time doing this today. Algorithms, block and stream. The key is secret. Encrypt and decrypt is secret. So key management is a challenge for both, okay? But in particular, for symmetric algorithms, whenever those key exchanges are made, if that's not handled properly, it's very easy to blow things apart. And when you look at the types of encryption algorithms that are used for things like Wi-Fi encryption, AES, when you look at TPM chips and hardware, uh, they're typically those are examples of fast encryption that occurs on a very low level in the background. But basically, the keys, there are methods in place to protect those keys, because if the keys are compromised or exposed, then whoever gets those keys can read the stuff. Okay. So control of the key is paramount. Now, what you're going to find is that the other type is the more commonly known one. If you've ever seen certificates, right, on websites. So the public-private key pair, asymmetric, you have two different kinds of keys to encrypt and decrypt. And the one key is needed. So essentially, the private key is what is kept and secured. It's the public key that's shared with others. And essentially, there's a system where you can manage all this with certificates. In Microsoft, it's called the Certificate Authority Service, or CA service. So you can implement a domain integrated system, and essentially public-private key pairs can also be used to sign email. So one use of email is to sign to prove your identity, right? And the private key that only belongs to you is stored in a secure location, and it's tied to your identity as a user, your digital identity as a user. And that is what proves when you send an email and you sign it, or a company sends digitally signed hardware drivers for their hardware components, right? When these are compromised, essentially hackers can modify a hardware driver, and in a server operating system environment, the hardware components of a server operating system are very low level, very privileged. And this is one avenue of attack where hackers can often change the kernel, or corrupt or modify the kernel of an operating system, the very internals, like the heart, lung, or brain of the operating system. They can embed a lot of malware in there, and it's hidden because we call that a kernel level attack, right? So you'll find in secure environments, operating systems can be configured to require properly signed hardware digital drivers, right? In asymmetric, so let's finish the thought about asymmetric. Asymmetric keys are complements. They're are complements the ciphers. So I'm going to say the ciphers. Keys are ciphers. Everybody still with me? Whenever we say keys, we can use the term cipher.
Yeah.
They're not identical, though mathematically they are complements of each other. One is designated as the private key, not for distribution. The other public, which can be shared to decrypt or validate. Shoot. Decrypt or validate identity signatures. Okay. Digital signing. That's it in a nutshell for encryption. Now, a deep dive, we can work a deep dive in, and we do work a deep dive in other courses, and there's a module that will be dedicated exclusively to this in systems security, where we go into much greater depth. The important thing to understand is that in a domain environment, right? So in a work group, components of encryption are stored locally. Now, when you say components of encryption, we're talking about computer identities, system accounts, let's say hardware and software components associated with encryption. System accounts, user logins, right? We've already covered that. In a domain, they're centrally stored. In an enterprise SAM, these are stored on a domain controller. All right, so one other thing we want to talk about, we want to take a moment to talk about, all right, there are two special cases. One hardware, and that's called TPM. Has anyone ever heard of TPM?
No.
All right. So I think what we're going to do is put this thought up here. Sorry, we're working some furious edits here, but I just want to make sure that this is readily available for you as soon as we're finished with the class. All right, so TPM. Let's take a moment. Let's just stretch a minute. And in 15 seconds, we're going to talk about TPM, right? All right. Is everybody back? Everybody with us? Quick stretch.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, wait.
So there was a security initiative associated with hardware manufacturers. And what hardware manufacturers did was they hopped onto the symmetric encryption bandwagon, okay? And they created a hardware component that was embedded on laptops and workstations, PCs. And in the BIOS, you can enable this or disable this. And quite often, in recent years, manufacturers enable these things by default. The hardware component, the TPM chip, stores the ciphers that are used to encrypt an entire disk. So when you're talking about data storage media, a TPM chip for a given system is unique. It's like a fingerprint, and it's associated only with that system. So TPM chips pose a special challenge, right? Because TPM is associated with only one device and hard soldered to the motherboard. You have to have it. It must be functional to decrypt whole disk encryption. Now that's a huge thing. That is amazingly complex. So when you talk about forensic challenges, and there are different versions of TPM implemented. The first one was kind of a dog, and there were cases where, okay, a motherboard was destroyed and the encryption key that was used and stored in the TPM chip, and there you see 2.0, so that's the newer version. The original version of the TPM chip, it was stored on the chip, and if the motherboard was destroyed, even if you transplanted the disk to another machine, because the TPM chip was unique and different for each system, you wouldn't have the key to decrypt it, and you couldn't. So in terms of a forensic challenge, if whole disk encryption is turned on the BIOS level for a system, and you capture a disk that is whole disk encrypted, and the TPM is enabled, you cannot, under any circumstances, decrypt the disk. Now, this is also true of FireVault, what used to be called FireVault, and I think in the latest version of the OS X Mac world, it may still be called FireVault, but basically there's a TPM chip in Macs, and when you enable FireVault, you're encrypting the entire hard disk. Now, why do you care? If you don't have the system, you can't decrypt it. So you have to confiscate the system in order to work the forensics. So you must confiscate the system to decrypt the contents. Now that's a pain. Unless ahead of time, the recovery keys, codes are stored in advance of a crisis. Typically, this is done by IT staff. So you have tech support staff, right? And when they issue a system, what they should do is go into the BIOS. So in earlier versions, yeah, recovery, in case you lose the hardware, you lose the TPM chip, you're screwed. You can't do anything. In later versions, there were built-in methods. So the BIOS included and the TPM technology included a means to decrypt the whole disk, but you had to capture the special codes that were rendered on screen, right? So you would go into the BIOS and you would look this stuff up, and then there's an option for recovery keys or codes. And so you'd have to record all that. And then there's a utility by the manufacturer. Is everybody hearing this? Everybody hearing this? There's a recovery utility by the manufacturer that is supposed to allow the use of the recovery keys or codes. And then with the special software and utilities provided by the manufacturer, you're supposed to be able to decrypt the entire disk, the physical disk, because the entire thing is encrypted with very strong encryption and a symmetric cipher, right? So holy buckets. Wow, is that a problem? Here's where a domain environment can be helpful. So they're making strides all the time to improve and enhance TPM encryption. And TPM is a hardware-based whole disk encryption method. There are other whole disk encryption methods. In Windows, it's called BitLocker. In OS X, it's called Firewall, and there are other cool, sexy names in the Linux world. But essentially, the thing to understand is that if it engages TPM components, it's tied, it's welded, it's fused. It's like Siamese twins with, everybody knows what a Siamese twin is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And see here you see a connection into the TPM module, right? So there are all these special, see that's a little TPM module that's mounted on a set of pins that you can insert here, so you can physically include TPM or remove TPM. TPM 2.0 is often hard soldered into the motherboard of many motherboards, so you can't remove it. The newer versions, again, allow for better recovery options. The point I'm trying to, there's one, it's hard soldered, right? Hard soldered into the motherboard, that's not going away. If something burns, fries, you can swap out the motherboard, but surprise, when you plug the disk in, it just won't work. And that part of data recovery is a specialty challenge both for IT staff, support and technical staff, but also for forensic specialists. And you need to understand how that thing works, okay? Now, newer implementations of TPM provide this, like I said, enhanced or extended means of recovery. And here you see this term private key, right? So if it's fast encryption and you have to work very rapid displays and transmissions of data, symmetric encryption keys are the way to go. But what I want to do is transition to this notion about public-private key pairs. So if we talk about asymmetric computing, So, so the final thought about a TPM chip is that the methods and recovery options are quickly evolving and involve um, very important encryption components, and each generation is different. And if you're a forensic specialist and you're working with different devices and systems that use generation one, generation two, and you know the latest, you have to be read up on how the keys work, how the recovery options are structured, and so on. And that's incredibly problematic. Um, any Given the information I have just presented to you, can you think of any important questions, or would you care to share any comments or experiences? Has anyone ever worked with a TPM module or enabled it on their system and then moved a hard disk? Has anyone ever done that kind of stuff? Or does anyone have any questions about what we've just presented? Now, I want to go back to this. Remember that if you're in a work group environment, some of the components associated with that encryption, hardware and software encryption, those are based on the local security account management model. And if you lose the SAM, right? By the way, passwords are stored locally on each system using a hash. So clear text passwords are not typically stored on systems. So that's one aspect. You can recover password hashes. And in terms of digital proactive or preemptive, preventive digital forensics, it's a good idea to use things like dictionary attacks, Bloom filters, and rainbow tables to help discover users who are bad stewards of passwords. Okay, so consider use of, and we're going to say preemptive or preventive use, right? Preventive use of dictionary attacks, Bloom filters, and rainbow tables for very large organizations. To discover, or I'll say detect, to detect users who are poor stewards of passwords. Okay, so now what happens if you're in a domain environment? And by the way, if you're in a workgroup environment, you can work with certificates. You can use asymmetric. You can self-sign the identity. You can create a self-signed certificate. That means you're creating your own public-private key pair. So in a standalone context, private public key pairs, certificates can be created for use by users but are tied to that specific system. So a domain environment has many advantages. what I'd like to do is kind of segue into the type of encryption and options that you have when you're working in a scenario that has centralized account management, enterprise account management, or domain. So let's look at a home environment. And let's pretend that I have a special folder called secrets. Can everybody see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to view large icons. And let's say that I want to encrypt this, right? So I'm going to go into the properties, and then I go into advanced. Can everybody see how this is grayed out?
Yeah, the encrypt contents of secure data.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's grayed out. So if I want to use built-in file system encryption, not to encrypt the entire hard drive, right? I don't want to encrypt the entire hard drive. I want to encrypt a folder. I want to encrypt a directory and its contents. If I have a professional version of Windows, I can do that, and this is not grayed out. That's called EFS, Encryption File System. And what I want to do is show you how that looks and works on a server where it's a corporate edition of the operating system. And then I want to talk about how cool it is. And then you're going to have an opportunity to set up EFS because we're going to provide you with some logins and such. And we want you to be able to work with those encryption keys and understand how to recover. So when you're using a professional or corporate or education edition of Windows on the client side or any of the server versions of Windows, this is not grayed out. And you can select that and then click details, or you can, well, select that. The moment you select that, a pop-up window, the first time you do it, a pop-up window will appear and it says, hey, it's a good idea to keep a backup of the key for this encryption. And it's going to suggest that you create and save a spare key so that you can unlock that directory in case something happens. And it typically creates a certificate, right? So a certificate is a logical envelope for a cipher. A certificate is nothing more than a logical container for a cipher, and it's just cool and sexy to call them certificates, because usually certificates authenticate somebody's, a birth certificate authenticates a person's identity, right? That's what a birth certificate does. So think certificate, it has to do with identity assurance, right? Among other things. And that's an oversimplification, but it's an analogy. All right, so at this point, what I'd like to do is connect. This is another reason why I'm working remotely. I would like to connect to one of my systems in the States. And this is where I'm taking pause to pray. No, okay, let's try another option. I'll use Bellatrix. Here I am using an alternate system. Is this a client operating system or a server operating system?
client.
It's a client. It's a client operating system, but it is a professional. It's higher than a professional. So corporate edition and education are higher. Education N implies a certain mix of features that are exclusively well, they're of interest to education environments and organizations. I'm going to open this up and I'm going to create on my system called Bellatrix on my C drive. I'm going to create a folder called secrets. Everybody can still see this, yeah?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, I'm very glad to hear that. So I go into properties and I go into advanced, just in the general tab, not in these other ones. Advanced. Can everyone see how this is no longer grayed out?
Yep.
Okay. Now, what I'm about to do, hopefully, is prompt this. I'm pretty sure I didn't do this before. I'm going to go ahead and say, okay. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to go into secrets and I'm going to create another folder called bad stuff. And I'm going to create a folder called, well, it's a text document. We'll call it login credentials, right? So my account name is admin and my password is password in leak speak, right? So let's just say I have a secret file where I'm doing that kind of stuff. And I go back to secrets and I'm like, oh, I better protect this because there's really important information in this. So I go to properties and then I click advanced. And yeah, I could hide this. I could hide the folder so it isn't viewable unless somebody changes the view to show hidden folders, right? And then it pops right up. But so that's one thing that hackers will do. And that's something that you need to be aware of in, let's make it hidden. All right. And I'm going to apply the change to folders, subfolders, and files. So the subdirectory is hidden. My spare directory disappears. That is until someone who's a forensics evidence specialist comes by and says, yeah, I want to see all the hidden items inside the C directory. And lo and behold, it's faded, indicating that it's right. And then there are permission issues. Is that an empty folder? Yes or no?
No.
It's not. I just put something in there. So
Oh,
yeah, can you see? Yes, was there a question?
oh, no. I was saying it's not empty.
Yep. Okay. So we make it read only, we make it hidden. That may pose a problem if I make it read only and then try to make changes. So I might have to take that off just to work with it, right? I don't want everything read only. I'm going to encrypt the contents of the data. And when I hit OK and then apply, and it says you have chosen to make the following attribute changes to encrypt it. Should I apply it to this directory only or to this folder, subfolders, and files? I'm going to leave the second option. There. Everybody see this? It's quick. A little pop-up that says, hey, did everybody catch that in the lower corner? Hello? Can everybody see this?
Ooh, yeah.
So there was a little pop-up that occurred down here, and if I hadn't caught it, right, and it says, why should I back up the certificate and key? Well, see, if I'm using EFS, encryption file system, I'm not encrypting the entire disk. But this is a standalone system. I'm not a part of a domain. If I look at my advanced system settings and I look at my computer name, I have changed the name of the default work group to another work group just for security purposes, but Bellatrix, which is star or constellation, I can't remember which. It's a heavenly body. It's out there in the, in the sky. Bellatrix is not part of a domain. And whether you're part of a domain or standalone, it's going to prompt you and ask you for an extra copy of the certificate. And here's the challenge. If you're in a bring your own device work environment, a BYOD work environment, every user, every employee owns their own device. They're not part of the domain, not typically. And if you have to help or assist or participate in a forensic investigation and their login is compromised, their user account is turned to hamburger, the encryption key for this encryption and decryption is joined to the hip with the login of this particular user, and it's stored locally on this system. So if you don't have the inclination to back up now and don't waste time, right? You're going to want to export the certificate and keep a copy of the key. Now, there are a couple of things that kind of bear special attention. Would it make sense to put the copy of the key in the encrypted folder?
No.
No. That's because the key's inside there, and if you lose the ability to decrypt because the account is no longer valid, then it's encrypted, but what you need to decrypt it is actually inside there, right? Good answer. Does it make sense to put it in other directories where you have protected information and you store the key with protected information off the system, like a thumb drive? Should you keep the encrypted information on a thumb drive and keep a copy of the key on the same thumb drive? By the way, did everybody see the padlock up here? That's how you know.
Yeah, we could.
Yeah, that's how you know it's encrypted. If you lose the thumb drive and you include the key that's stored as a backup in your secret thumb drive, what does that allow anyone to do?
Access it.
Access it, right? So I'm just saying, what do you want to do with that key? OMG, right? Exclamation point, exclamation point. You want to make sure you keep the key or the copy somewhere where it's safe. So I'm going to go ahead and say next. And then I'm going to say export all extended properties, right? Because I want everything included. I'm going to say next. I'm going to password protect the key as an added security measure. So I'm going to put in a strong password or one that I only know. And then I'm going to record that somehow. I have a chance to encrypt it with triple des SHA-1, right? Or I can use AES. Which one do you think I should be using? SHA-256, AES 256, or triple des?
SHA-256.
Yeah, the default setting that was there has already been hacked or broken, which I find irritating. It's like, come on, guys, you wouldn't put a better standard there, right? So I'm going to say next. Now I got to put a file name somewhere. I'm going to put this in the temp folder for now, but I'm not going to leave it in my temp folder because if somebody gets on my system, I don't want them creating a problem, right? The file name, am I going to use it Am I gonna use a file name that says secret key? EFS backup key? Am I gonna use a provocative name like that?
Definitely not.
Definitely not, right? Now, mind you, this is something I have to do in advance. If I'm gonna have access as a digital evidence specialist supporting a work environment, and people don't do this up front, if you don't coordinate with the IT staff to do this with their users or your clients up front with your clients, when it's time for you to help them, you're going to be limited in terms of what you can help them. You're going to be limited in terms of what you can access or decrypt, and you're going to be limited in terms of what you can provide for artifacts or evidence when they have to make hard decisions. In other words, they're going to look at you and go, too bad you're not like a technology trained person in addition to being a digital evidence specialist, because our IT staff could have done this for us if you had only asked them, right? Those are not the kinds of things you want popping up in the middle of an investigation. I'm gonna give it, what's the account that I use to log in to Bellatrix? Anybody know what my account is? Okay. Should I, since this key, this EFS backup key is associated with a specific account, it won't be useful unless I know which account it's rigged with. Okay, does everybody understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, and guess what? A backup key for the next login on this system is different. And the next login for this system is different. So if I have multiple users on this system, I have different keys. I'm gonna put in some kind of, I'm gonna put in some kind of, I'm gonna put in a name that isn't gonna create needless attraction. I'll say TK details, something like that, right? Something that isn't, or I'll just put TK, right? Just the initials. And I'll know what that means, because if I have different users with different initials, then that's enough. And I don't have to label it or say otherwise, but I have to have some kind of, now I could use the last numbers in a security ID, right? If I wanted to be more cryptic, and then you'd have to go into the registry and look up the SID or issue a command to display the security ID. And then I could reference the PFX backup key based on the last 3 digits of their security ID. So I could make it hard for somebody to understand, okay, what is that and what is it for? And I could have my own internal method of categorizing, cataloging, and securing the decryption keys so that I don't end up with egg on my face. But the average hacker is going to get on there and they're going to go, what the hell is 052.pfxx? They aren't even going to know what it's used for, right? In fact, I'm going to do that. I'm going to put in 052, and I know that that's a notional last 3 digits of a security ID, and no 2 are duplicated, okay? Everybody with me?
Yep.
So then I say next, and then I finish the wizard. The export was successful. Yay, it was successful. So now I have something here in Windows. It knows it's PFX. It's going to display the certificate icon, right? So if I view this with extra large icons, that's a little more obvious, right? Not very many people display with the largest icons, but even the large icons show the key. Medium icons, yeah, it's still obvious, isn't it, right? So is this the kind of thing I want to leave in my temp folder? Nope,
Nope.
not really. Don't really want to do that, okay? Hard to read there, but all anybody has to do is change the view, and then they get a clue about what it is and what it does. Okay, They're just left to wonder, what the hell is 052? And unless they know to look up security IDs in the registry for that given system. Now, imagine, and I'm just saying, okay? I want you to imagine how much legwork you'd have to mess with in a standalone security environment. Everybody? That's for one machine. What we just walked through was one machine in a professional, for a practice using professional versions of the operating system. And by the way, I just want to put out this plug. If you're supporting clients and they're using a home edition for their professional consultancy or their business, tell them to knock it off. Tell them you don't have the time to deal with people who are going to hurt themselves because they can't afford to spend 99 bucks to get a proper operating system that's more bulletproof, that can be encrypted, that has better recovery options, that has better support. If you're professional grade, then spend the money to buy and upgrade a version of Windows that is professional grade. You should insist on this. Anybody you work with in the technology world that goes, yeah, well, it is what it is, we can't convince them, then you advocate. You become the evangelist, okay? Because you have options at least to recover if they're used. But I want to get back to this point. Every domain controller is automatically endowed with a decryption key. Automatically, they are the recovery agent for the entire domain. So anyone who has a domain login who encrypts, you don't have to go through this with anyone at any point, because you already, if you're the domain administrator can open encrypted files and it's seamless. They just click on it and they open it up, and they don't even have to like recover a key from a special repository. It's all built in to the domain environment. I hope that that impresses the hell out of you. And I hope that when it comes to our review of hashing and encryption and important considerations and challenges, right? Now, we already said that TPM, right? TPM is in a rapid state of evolution, and it's possible that there could be centrally managed options to work with TPM encryption, whole disk encryption, through domain interests. I know you can enforce specific policies, security policies on a domain level when you're in a domain environment. So we could see some better ways to centrally manage the use of TPM and whole disk encryption. Well, it's all right. So there are security policies, and I think there's criteria for BitLocker. So that's something that requires a special look. I just want to call that to your attention. This environment is far superior. It takes about $1,000 to invest in a workgroup server and server operating system and a domain environment. And then all of this stuff is, even for a small environment, there's no excuse why everyone who works this kind of stuff shouldn't be in a domain environment. So if you want to be a professional forensic investigator and you're working with clients who are doing this, tell them to run, not walk. Tell them to set up a professional infrastructure with professional licenses for their operating systems, or advise them of the realities, your limitations, what you won't be able to do. Tell them up front why it's a good investment, and tell them how the professional grade of encryption can be an important security enhancement for their technology environment, right? So not only are you going to be better equipped to serve them, they're going to be better equipped to implement encryption seamlessly, right? How long did it take me? I'm just asking, how long did it take me to demonstrate the use of encryption right here? A couple of mouse clicks, right? And what happens if a hacker gets a hold of this folder? Let's say the hacker gets in there and they exfiltrate the secrets directory. Do they have the key to read the secrets directory? If I throw the secrets directory onto a USB because somebody got in there, can they look at it inside? No. They have to plug the USB into the same system. Then they have to log in with the same user account, which means they'd have to be able to get in there. And if you have two-factor authentication, even if they know the password, they can't log in. Does everybody understand what I'm saying here? This is pretty darn bulletproof, but it's also a huge nightmare if you're called in to help with a disgruntled former employee who set all this up. And worse, it's BYOD, right? It's their own device. What do? Right? That's where your advanced engagement with your clients to educate, raise awareness, and train them make all the difference in the world when it comes to the tools. You want to have tools, you want to have the capacity, you want to work with a TPM chip where you can recover, and that has to be set up in advance. And if they don't have a technology consultant, you are the technology consultant. You have to set up the recovery options, and I would advise testing them in advance before you start working with any organization. Now, what do you do if it's a worst case scenario and you're called, and then you have to try to figure out how to reverse some of this stuff? Well, that's a special topic, and that would be an ideal focus area for any of you who are interested in elective credits to complete your concentration. Okay. So I just want to plant a seed. If you are interested in a focus area topic, you could investigate, okay, worst case scenario, I'm a digital evidence specialist. I'm a forensic expert, and I'm called to help recover data or find out what happened. And some of this stuff is encrypted, and here's how it's encrypted. And OMG, how do we reverse this, right? How do we blast through this? That would be an excellent focus area for any of you who are in our concentration and you're looking for a special topic to investigate. Okay. You could do an internship at a workplace. You could do some independent study or independent research, and that would be, I'm just sharing that as an option. Now, we're going to close for today. Are there any questions or comments that you can think of that would be good to share given what we've just covered? I know we covered a lot. Now, one final thought. This scenario is so much better in terms of the use of encryption, but it's still standalone security account management. And there are still huge limitations. So once again, have those conversations, plant those seeds, water and tend them, right? Right? Keep cultivating that. Work with your IT staff, and they'll consider to be your secret weapon. You're the secret weapon for your IT staff, right? They'll love you for this. You know, because IT folks are always looking for ways to manage the environment more effectively. And some IT folks are afflicted with, well, people who hired them who are cheap and stupid and inflexible and don't give a darn about anything until it bites them in the backside and ruins them. And if you're loyal and faithful to them, You'll have the hard conversation. You'll find a pleasant, palatable way. You won't turn loose. You won't let go. You will continue to insist so that the better practices empower your own capacity to serve them better and prevent bad things from happening in the first place. Okay. All right.